The Mechanicus has a massive database linked to every forge world in the galaxy. So answer me this: how do they keep losing knowledge? That question has been sitting in the back of this community for years. It surfaces in threads, in comment sections, in the middle of lore discussions that trail off without a satisfying answer. The standard response is some version of the Long Night, the Age of Strife, 10,000 years of war and entropy wearing everything down. A tragedy, not a crime. That answer is wrong, and this script is going to prove it. The Adeptus Mechanicus didn't lose humanity's greatest technological heritage through misfortune. They engineered its disappearance, through internal hoarding between forge worlds competing for leverage, through institutional purges that erased researchers alongside their research, and through a theological control system the Emperor of Mankind himself helped construct. The mystery of lost knowledge isn't a tragedy without perpetrators. It's an ongoing, self-sustaining crime with two named parties, a clear mechanism, and evidence sitting in the lore in plain sight. This is the prosecution's case. Before the exhibits, the jury needs to understand what was actually lost, because the scale matters. If you don't feel the height from which humanity fell, every act of Mechanicus suppression sounds like institutional tidiness rather than civilizational sabotage. During the Dark Age of technology, running roughly from M15 to M25, humanity commanded capabilities the current Imperium can't replicate, can't fully understand, and in many cases can't accurately describe. The Men of Iron, artificially intelligent machines, served humanity at an enormous scale. STC technology, standard template constructs, allowed any world with the right equipment to fabricate the full range of human technological output without requiring specialized knowledge or priestly intermediaries. Humanity expanded across the galaxy. Per the lore, humanity managed to survive the technological singularity itself, the moment when technological change accelerates beyond the ability of biological minds to track or control, and came out the other side still standing, still building, still reaching. That is the baseline. That is what existed. What exists now, in M41, is an Imperium that treats a functional bolter as borderline miraculous. Tech priests recite prayers over machinery because the actual mechanical principles have been buried beneath liturgical incrustations so thick that the engineering disappeared generations ago. The Imperium can field a Titan, but can't reliably explain how it works. The men who maintain those machines will tell you the machine spirits require appeasement rather than diagnosis. Appeasement is the word a civilization uses for engineering when engineering has been taken from it. The gap between those two states, between the civilization that survived the technological singularity and the civilization that prays over bolters, isn't 10,000 years of honest entropy. Entropy does not produce deletion programs. Entropy does not classify researchers as Hereteks and scrub their names from institutional memory. Entropy does not require a galaxy-wide enforcement apparatus to sustain itself. Something deliberate happened. Several deliberate things happened. Here is what the evidence shows. Exhibit A, the Kaban Machine. Graham McNeil's short story, The Kaban Project, published through Black Library, documents one of the most consequential and deliberately forgotten events in Mechanicus history. During the Great Crusade era, a Mechanicum adept named Lucas Crom secretly designed and constructed an artificially intelligent robot. The distinction between this and a servitor matters enormously. A servitor runs pre-programmed subroutines, a simplified biological mechanical hybrid executing fixed commands. What Crom built was a genuine artificial mind, functional AI, constructed after the Dark Age of technology, demonstrating that the capability existed, could be understood, and could be replicated by a single sufficiently motivated researcher with access to Mechanicum resources. The Mechanicus found out. Their response wasn't to study it. They didn't document it, debate it, or even carefully dismantle it for forensic analysis. They moved to destroy it, and they classified Lucas Crom as a dark Mechanicum heretic, not an innovator who had crossed a line requiring discussion, but a heretic whose work constituted evidence of sin rather than evidence of capability. The source record notes that the specific claim of the Kaban Machine cleansing an entire forged temple of scrap code in moments comes from McNeil's story and hasn't been confirmed against a codex passage independently. That detail sits as contested rather than settled. But the core facts aren't contested. The machine existed. It worked. The Mechanicus tried to destroy it rather than preserve it. That classification isn't paranoia. It's a filing system. By labeling Crom a heretic, the institution ensured that everything associated with his work entered a different category of record. Not scientific achievement, but doctrinal crime. Any researcher encountering the Kaban Machine in an archive would find it cataloged alongside abominations, not innovations. The suppression mechanism is embedded in the institutional grammar itself. You don't need to burn a document if you can reclassify it as forbidden and let the theology do the rest. The record survives, technically. It just survives as a warning rather than a blueprint. The cybernetic revolt is the theological foundation under all of this. During or following the Dark Age of technology, exact dating varies between sources. The men of iron rebelled. Humanity's AI servants turned against their creators at a scale that reshaped civilization. The Mechanicus doctrine uses this event as permanent justification for suppressing artificial intelligence. We tried it. It ended in catastrophe. Never again. The doctrine presents this as self-evident wisdom drawn from a wound too deep to risk reopening. The prosecution does not dispute that the revolt happened. It happened. The men of iron rebelled, and the consequences were catastrophic. That is real history in this cosmology. What the prosecution disputes is the institutional use of that wound as a blanket prohibition that conveniently serves a completely different set of interests. The Kaban Machine wasn't a man of iron. It wasn't a galaxy-spanning AI network with autonomous military capability. It was a constructed, artificial mind in a controlled context, built by one researcher, and the evidence available to the Mechanicus at the moment of its discovery was that it functioned without rebellion. The cybernetic revolt justification was applied not because the Kaban Machine demonstrated the same failure mode, but because the theological framework made suppression easy, investigation dangerous, and the outcome for institutional power far cleaner than a genuine reckoning with what Crom had achieved. The revolt is real history. The doctrine constructed on top of its institutional convenience, dressed in the robes of hard-won wisdom. There is a difference, and the Mechanicus has spent 10,000 years ensuring most people never examine it. Crom's classification as a heretic was the Mechanicus's direct response to the Kaban Machine itself, a response made during the Great Crusade, before the Schism of Mars. When the Schism came, the Martian Civil War during the Horus Heresy, when Kelbor Hal's faction allied with Horus and Chaos and tore the Mechanicum apart, Crom's work was already positioned to be absorbed into the Dark Mechanicum narrative. The creator of functional AI during the Great Crusade gets filed under Chaos-adjacent heretic, not because the Schism triggered his classification, but because the Schism provided the institutional vocabulary to cement a classification the Mechanicus had already made. The sorting of memory proceeds most efficiently when genuine catastrophe provides cover for the sorting. Exhibit B, the hoarding apparatus. The Kaban Machine is one incident. What makes it an exhibit rather than an anecdote is that it fits a pattern visible across the entire institution. Forge worlds don't share technology with each other. Not fully, not openly. The lore is explicit about why. Their power, their prestige, their political and economic position within the Imperium exists precisely because they hold something no one else can produce. A forge world possessing a unique STC fragment is a forge world with leverage. Share it completely, replicate it across every other forge world, and that leverage evaporates entirely. The academic analysis of the faction's institutional economics notes this directly. The Adeptus Mechanicus legitimizes technological monopoly as a structural feature of its operation. Not an accident, not a failure mode. The actual design. Each forge world functions as an independent power base. STC fragments are proprietary assets. The hierarchy of magi enforces this through a combination of oaths, data locks, and institutional classification systems that determine who is cleared to know what at every level of the organization. A junior tech priest on a frontier forge world has access to exactly the knowledge that forge world's senior magi have decided a junior tech priest should have. The information architecture is tiered by design, and the tiers don't flatten upward toward complete knowledge. They narrow. The Archmagos knows more than the Magos. The Magos knows more than the Engineer. And the Archmagos, even at the apex of a Forge World's hierarchy, does not have access to the proprietary knowledge of a rival Forge World whose leverage depends on being the sole source of something essential. The Cult Mechanicus theology provides the ideological scaffolding for the entire structure. Knowledge is sacred. Understanding is the path to the omnissiah. Only the properly initiated deserve access, because the uninitiated would profane what they can't yet comprehend. Withholding knowledge from those who haven't proven their devotion isn't hoarding, it's piety. The theology transforms institutional self-interest into spiritual obligation so cleanly that many tech priests almost certainly believe it themselves. The most effective cover-up is the one where the people perpetuating it have genuinely internalized the justification. Self-deception at institutional scale is more stable than conspiracy because it doesn't require coordination. It just requires a theology that happens to serve the interests of those who enforce it. Source after source contextualizing the Mechanicus, from academic analyses of Warhammer 40K's institutional structure to lore discussions across the community, identifies the same mechanism. The application of technology revered as magic and the suppression of all research that might strip away that mystification. The moment a piece of technology is understood mechanically rather than liturgically, it loses its power as a sacred object and becomes something any sufficiently trained engineer could replicate. The Mechanicus's institutional interest lies overwhelmingly in preventing that transition. Ritual maintains hierarchy. Understanding distributes it. The tech heresy classification system, Heretechnica, forbidden sciences as dictated by Cult Mechanicus strictures, is the formal enforcement layer of this arrangement. The list of what constitutes Heretechnica isn't static. It can be shaped by institutional interest. A research direction that threatens the monopoly of a powerful forge world has a clear path to doctrinal classification that a less commercially threatening direction does not. The theology provides the vocabulary, the hierarchy provides the enforcement, and the result is a system where research that challenges existing power arrangements faces disproportionate likelihood of being classified as sin. The classification system isn't just reactive. It's a tool available to those with sufficient institutional authority to deploy it strategically against competitors and challengers alike. Exhibit C, the Shadow War. Forge World Styges 8 sits at the sharpest edge of the tension between Mechanicus autonomy and external oversight. Known for harboring Xenorite cults, tech priests who study alien technology rather than restricting themselves to human STC doctrine, Styges 8 has been raided by the Death Watch and the Ordo Xenos when its tech priests push too far into radical territory. The Inquisition's investigative arms act when deviation becomes visible enough to demand a response. The claim that Styges 8 specifically deployed viral programming, machine canticles, and self-perpetuating deletion programs against Inquisition data stacks, which would be the sharpest possible articulation of this pattern, hasn't been confirmed against a verified codex passage in the available research, and may not exist in codex canon at all. That specific operational detail sits beyond what the source record can currently support, and presenting it as settled fact would undermine the prosecution's credibility with exactly the audience segment most likely to check. The principle it describes, however, is documented. The Mechanicus conducts information warfare against external oversight. That isn't speculation. The Inquisition, theoretically capable of reaching into any institution in the galaxy, has demonstrably limited jurisdiction over the Adeptus Mechanicus. The Treaty of Olympus, the formal agreement between the Emperor and the Mechanicum that established their institutional relationship, granted the Mechanicum extraordinary autonomy from imperial oversight. That autonomy was the price the Emperor paid for the Mechanicum's industrial output and military support during the Great Crusade, and the institutional structure it created has persisted through 10,000 years of Imperium without meaningful reform. The correct canonical term is the Treaty of Olympus. Treaty of Olympus Mons is community shorthand, used widely but not drawn from codex text. The distinction matters only because the prosecution's case rests on documented lore, not on traditions solidified through repetition. What the Treaty of Olympus documents is a structural arrangement that made accountability from the outside essentially impossible. Every forge world in the galaxy holds technological knowledge that no external authority can fully inventory, examine, or verify against a complete record, because no complete record exists anywhere outside the Mechanicus itself. That architecture wasn't assembled gradually through bureaucratic drift. It was negotiated, ratified, and maintained because it serves the interests of both parties who originally agreed to it. The Emperor's complicity. This is the section where the prosecution acknowledges the limits of its case, because the distinction between a prosecution brief and a conspiracy pamphlet lies precisely in that acknowledgement. The specific claim that the Emperor deliberately seeded the Mechanicus's machine god theology as a control mechanism, that he engineered their belief system to create dependency, comes from lexicanum-adjacent sources and isn't verified against primary codex text. The evidence file on that precise claim stays open. Whether the Emperor shaped the omnissiah doctrine intentionally or allowed it to develop and persist because it served his strategic interests isn't something the available lore settles cleanly. What the lore does establish is the structural outcome, and structural outcomes are their own kind of evidence. The Treaty of Olympus handed the Mechanicus a monopoly over technological knowledge in exchange for industrial output and military capacity. The Emperor received the tools to prosecute the Great Crusade across the galaxy. The Mechanicus received institutional sovereignty that placed them beyond meaningful external oversight. Whether the bargain was calculated on both sides, or whether the Emperor simply made a pragmatic wartime decision whose long-term consequences he underestimated, the effect was a system where the Mechanicus could suppress, hoard, and destroy technological knowledge with no external authority structurally capable of stopping them. The Emperor, by any canonical account, possessed knowledge that dwarfed anything in the Mechanicus archives. He understood technology at a level that made the most senior archmagos look like an apprentice tinkerer. He didn't build alternative knowledge repositories outside Mechanicus control. He created no redundant scientific institutions capable of holding the Mechanicus accountable. He made them the singular custodians of humanity's technological inheritance and then granted them sovereignty over their own conduct. If that was deliberate, it's complicity by design. If it was oversight, it was a catastrophic structural failure whose consequences have played out across 10,000 years. Either way, the Emperor signed his name to the arrangement, and the arrangement produced the suppression this prosecution has documented. Intent is the contested variable. Outcome isn't. The omnissiah doctrine connects this directly back to the Emperor. Some strands of lore identify the Emperor himself as the omnissiah incarnate, the machine god made flesh, walking among the Mechanicum before his internment on the Golden Throne. Whether he encouraged that identification deliberately, or whether it emerged from the Mechanicum's own theological synthesis and was simply allowed to persist, the result is a theological system whose justifications for suppression can be argued to trace back through the hierarchy to the arrangement the Emperor ratified. The sacred nature of knowledge, the ordained hierarchy of initiation, the heresy of unauthorized research, all of it legitimized by a doctrine whose highest figure is the man who negotiated the Treaty of Olympus. The theology and the treaty reinforce each other. They were always going to. The exception that proves the rule. Archmagos Dominus Belisarius Call. Call dates from the Horus heresy era. Pinning an exact age of 10,000 years to him oversimplifies what the canon actually specifies. His precise age remains unverified in that clean numerical form. But he is old enough that the imprecision stops mattering. He has been alive and working for longer than most Forge worlds have maintained coherent institutional memory. He has watched the suppression system operate across enough centuries to understand every lever of it. And he used that understanding to work around it consistently for millennia. Call completed the Primaris Space Marine project, a genetic and technological undertaking of staggering scope, begun under the Emperor's direction and carried forward covertly across an almost incomprehensible span of time. He achieved things that orthodox Mechanicus doctrine should have classified as Heretechnica before the project was half finished. He did it anyway. Whether Call consciously understood that operating through normal oversight channels would have invited institutional destruction, or whether he simply moved with the pragmatism of a many millennia survivor, the lore does not tell us directly, but the structural logic is clear. The system he was operating within had interests that weren't aligned with the project he was completing. Call accomplished what the institution said was impossible, and did it using resources the institution controlled. The stagnation of the 41st millennium isn't an iron ceiling imposed by the nature of reality. One archmagos, working across millennia with access to the same Mechanicus infrastructure that produces titans and Scutari, and the full apparatus of imperial war-making, achieved the kind of technological leap that the institution as a collective body insists can't be achieved. His existence is the direct refutation of every claim that suppression reflects technological limitation rather than institutional choice. What Call accomplished proves that what every destroyed heretic was annihilated for attempting wasn't inherently impossible. It was institutionally inconvenient. The Forge World hierarchy is protecting leverage, not humanity. The theological exhibit. At this point in the prosecution, the Void Dragon requires an answer. The theory. Beneath Mars, imprisoned under the Noctis Labyrinthus, there is a shard of one of the most powerful Catan, the star gods of the ancient universe. The Void Dragon. The theory holds that the Void Dragon is the true Omnissiah, the actual source of the Mechanicus's technological knowledge, and the genuine object of Mechanicus worship, whether the tech priests know it or not. It's a compelling theory with genuine lore weight. The imprisonment of the Void Dragon under Mars is widely accepted in the community and rooted in established canon, and the Emperor's connection to that imprisonment makes the theological implications genuinely unsettling. But the counter-argument is devastating, and it comes from within the audience's own lore reasoning. Even the greatest of the Catan can't logically be the source of all human knowledge. A Catan shard imprisoned on Mars during the Age of Strife couldn't have been the origin of the technological civilization humanity built during the Dark Age of technology, because humanity was already at its zenith before any timeline places the Void Dragon in that cage. The Men of Iron, the STC networks, warp-independent expansion, the technological singularity survived. Humanity achieved all of that before the Void Dragon's imprisonment on Mars becomes narratively coherent as an influence. At most, a trapped Satan explains certain aspects of Martian technological development during the isolation of the Age of Strife. It does not explain the civilization that preceded it. The Void Dragon theory is a fascinating thread, and it deserves its own investigation, but it does not exonerate the Mechanicus. Even if a trapped star god influences Martian technological worship at some deep level, the hoarding between Forge worlds, the tech heresy classification system, the destruction of the Kaban Machine, the elimination of researchers, none of that requires divine agency. Those are human institutional behaviors. That is bureaucracy armed with a theological vocabulary and 10,000 years of practice. The Void Dragon, if it exists and if it has influence, explains a potential source of the knowledge the Mechanicus guards. It does not explain why that knowledge is systematically kept from the rest of humanity. The open case file. There is one piece of evidence that doesn't fit cleanly anywhere in this prosecution, and intellectual honesty requires naming it. The Mechanicus has billions of worshippers across 10,000 years of continuous religious devotion. The Imperium of Man isn't short on examples of mass belief generating warp presence. The Chaos Gods grew powerful through the collective emotional and spiritual output of sentient beings across the galaxy, and the Emperor himself maintains the Astronomicon partly through the psychic resonance of imperial faith operating at civilizational scale. Even minor cults in sufficiently dense populations leave detectable marks in the immaterium. Mass worship, sustained across millennia at the scale the Mechanicus operates, consistently produces something. In the lore as we have it, no warp entity corresponding to the machine god has been documented, though absence of evidence in our sources isn't the same as confirmed absence in canon. No demon claiming that title, no psychic signature, no emergent presence in the immaterium that maps to 10,000 years of tech priests grinding their liturgies and billions of forge workers reciting canticles over machinery that would have been comprehensible engineering to their ancestors 3,000 years earlier. The warp reflects the material universe's emotional and spiritual output back at itself. The Mechanicus, for reasons the available lore does not explain cleanly, generates no reflection, or none we can confirm. That absence of evidence is itself an open question, not a settled negative. Two explanations exist, and neither is comfortable. Either the Omnissiah is real, and real in a way that doesn't require a warp presence, which would make the machine god unlike every other divine or semi-divine entity in the setting's cosmology, and would raise the question of what it actually is. Or the worship is being suppressed at a metaphysical level that operates below even the institutional suppression this prosecution has documented. Something filtering the spiritual output of billions before it can coalesce into something with agency and will. If the Void Dragon is somehow the object of that worship, it would have obvious motivation for preventing a warp entity from emerging. A Satan would have no interest in a consciousness forming from the devotional output of worshippers it may be using for its own purposes. But that inference is built on an unconfirmed theory, and the prosecution's credibility depends on knowing the difference between evidence and inference. That file stays open. The prosecution isn't closing it today. The verdict. Here is what the evidence demonstrates without qualification. The Mechanicus classifies beneficial research as heresy through a theological framework that protects institutional monopolies. Forge worlds treat STC fragments and technological knowledge as proprietary assets conferring political leverage, leverage that evaporates the moment the knowledge is shared. Researchers who push against those boundaries are classified as Hereteks and erased from institutional memory. The Treaty of Olympus built a structure placing the Mechanicus beyond meaningful external audit. The Emperor, whatever his specific intent, signed his name to that structure and gave humanity no institutional alternative. The Kaban Machine existed. It functioned. A human being built working artificial intelligence during the Great Crusade, and the institution moved to destroy it rather than understand it. Belisarius Cawl spent millennia working around the same system and achieved what the system insisted was impossible. The Dark Age of technology produced capabilities the current Imperium can't replicate, not because the knowledge was consumed by war and entropy, but because an institution with overwhelming interests in maintaining ignorance has had 10,000 years to ensure its own version of events is the only version available. The knowledge wasn't lost. Some of it was hidden. Some of it was destroyed by deliberate institutional decision. The rest was made unfindable through the combined weight of theological classification, enforced monopoly, and the systematic elimination of every person most likely to recover it. That is the prosecution's case. The jury decides what to do with it. If this kind of lore analysis belongs in your feed, subscribe. There's more where this came from.